Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Felipe Fernández-Armesto, who is a professor of history at the University of Notre Dame, and also the author of, well, a bunch of books, countless books, many of which I have with me. The latest book is one that's co-authored, and it's called How the Spanish Empire Was Built, a 400-year history, which touches on a topic which you have revisited multiple times, which is about conquerors and about Hispanic America and Latin America. You have this one called 1492, the year the world began. And this one, Pathfinders, a global history of exploration. This one, civilizations, culture, ambition, and the transformation of nature. Our America, Hispanic history of the United States. Perhaps my favorite, which is Near 1,000 Tables, a history of food. And then these two, Truth, a history, and Out of Our Minds, what we think and how we came to think it. Welcome, Felipe.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So, I trained as a professional historian, and one of the reasons why I gave up history was that I felt this relentless pressure to specialize, right, and to narrow the focus of my research to a sharp point. And you seem to have managed to escape that. I mean, you not only cover a wide range of geographical areas, but you also toggle back and forth between what we might think of as history of material culture, a la Fernand Braudel, to the history of ideas, R.G. Collingwood. I mean, this seems so unusual as a professional historian. How did you think about this? Did you always intend to be someone who was an omnivorous student of the past?
Well, I suppose if you weren't so kind, Greg, you'd say that I'm an intellectual flibbertigibbet with no resources of mental discipline. And I suppose that in a way, that is what I am. I'm interested in too many things to specialize. Indeed, I think the reason why I chose to be an historian is that it kind of covers everything. If you want to be a good historian, you've got to know a bit about economics and science and theology and philosophy. Whereas if you do almost anything else, you really can be a specialist. And I've always thought that specialization was a kind of academic vice, and that we specialize far too much, and we don't see the whole picture. We don't introduce our students to the whole picture. In the United States, we've got a really big problem in historical education, in my opinion, indeed in university education generally, that we very properly and rightly encourage students to be very broad-minded and to study a lot of different stuff, but we don't really have protocols for locating all those different courses in an overarching kind of context. So, I've always been looking at the overarching context, and you say, how did I manage to achieve it? I think the answer is with a great deal of pain, because early in my career, it was quite hard for me to get on, because people said, well, what's his special field? And I never had a special field, but I've always been interested in certain themes. I think they do run through all my work and give it some sort of unity. In particular, I'm interested in culture. I think history is a study of culture. I think it's a study of how and why and when culture changes. And that's really the central problem, I suppose, that I've always focused on. And you're right also in saying that an awful lot of my work is about empires, especially the Spanish Empire, which is exemplary. If you want to study empires, you should study the Spanish Empire, because in many ways it's the most extraordinary of the lot. In many ways it's the most representative of the lot. And I think the reason I'm interested in empires is that they are arenas, for forging culture, for people to exchange culture with one another. Empires give you that sort of political and economic framework in which that can that can happen. So yeah, I mean, it does all look as though I'm all over the place, but I'm kind of grounded as well.
Well, I hope we can talk about empires, but I also wanted to ask you, you have a position on historical truth. And going back to Cicero, the idea was that historians were supposed to recount the truth and keep their moral judgment to a minimum, right? And I think, that goes forward to the 19th century, and a lot of the German historians, was it von Moltke? Who was it? The historian who said that we should study it as it was?
I think that's von Ranke, yes.
Von Ranke. Von Moltke was the military guy, right?
Von Ranke, he was a strategist who devised ways of conquering France, which was no doubt
that's right. One of those
very important in its own way, but doesn't help us with the current problem.
Yeah, and but that seems to be sort of a I don't know, an antiquated or unpopular view of things, or even untenable in the modern world.
Well,
what is the role of historical truth?
I hope it's not untenable, because it's certainly my position. I mean, I'm not unwilling to make moral judgments. Of course, I'm a human being. Homo sum nihil humanum alienum pute. So I'm always making moral judgments. That's in my capacity as a human being. In my capacity as a professional historian, I try to avoid them. Indeed, in a way, on the contrary, what I try to do, which maybe goes beyond what Ranke was trying to do, is I try to sympathize with the people that I'm studying. I try to enter their own minds, their own mental worlds, to see things the way they saw. And that's one of the reasons why, in my work, an awful lot of art is deployed as historical evidence, because I think if you want to see the way people in the past, or in any culture different from your own, saw or see their world, look at their art, because that's where they give you their images of what the world is like to them. So I'm unwilling to make moral judgments, but I am very anxious to sympathise as deeply as I can with people in the past. And of course that includes people whom, at a human level, I disagree with and disapprove of. If one's going to understand what they were doing, you've got to understand why they did and why they thought that it was good and right, even if you and I might not see it in quite the same way as I did. So I think those are my reasons for avoiding moral judgments. And as for truth, yes, of course, yes. I want to know the truth, but, a very important truth about history is that we don't know what the truth is. We know only the truth of what the sources say. So we know what, particular people who've left us sources wanted us to think. And to some extent, I suppose we can corroborate that against archaeological evidence or dispassionate statistics if they happen to be available. But essentially, the problem of being an historian and telling the truth is that the evidence is not present to our senses, so we cannot test it in the same way that we can test the truth of assertions that are made by things that are happening in our own time. But there is a sort of truth, which is, this is what the sources say. It may not tell us the objective truth about what really happened, but if you can say for certain that a source says X, that's why I think humanism, documentary work, textual work is absolutely vital for historians, because that's where you can say, well, this is the truth according to the perspective of this writer or this culture or this civilization or this group of people.
Well, what I find most interesting about good history is that it decenters you to some degree, right? You are seeing things from a perspective that is perhaps fresh, right? So, obviously we have lots and lots of filters that we've inherited that lead us to view the past in particular ways. But when an historian brings to your attention perhaps a different set of sources, or perhaps a new techniques that uncover things that aren't normally in the narrative. For instance, empires tend to tell their own stories, and most people are familiar with the stories that the conquerors tell, and it's a lot more difficult to get access to the story of the folks who were conquered, let's say. So, I mean, is part of the job of the historian to look for those untold stories, look for those perspectives that have not become canonical?
Yes, of course. I try to teach a course at the University of Notre Dame about the colonial period of Spanish Mesoamerica, and it's entirely based on indigenous voices, entirely based on documents in indigenous languages which the students study in translation. So, nobody can decolonize my curriculum because I'm already looking at it. But the reason I do that isn't for any sort of woke reason or reason of political correctness. It's because it's just the fact that most people in colonial Spanish America were indigenous. And so if you want to understand what was going on, you've got to take that perspective on board, whether you want to or not. You could be the most, arrogant and confirmed racist, but you'd still be mad if you didn't take into account the indigenous point of view. And of course, one's always looking for new sources because that's how you enrich your sensibility. To being an historian, I think the question which underlies what you've just put to me is that of the role of the historian as a sort of actor, in which you try to put yourself in other people's shoes and to think the way they thought. So, if you're studying, the Yaza of Genghis Khan, you've got to think, well, what was it like to be this sort of bloodthirsty, hugely philo-progenitive world conqueror who wanted to live forever who thought massacre was a perfectly valid method of doing politics. So whereas if you're studying lawsuits in colonial Mesoamerica, you've got to try and penetrate the mental world of these indigenous complainants who were themselves struggling to reconcile to quite different cultures, the culture they'd inherited from their forebears and the culture to which they were introduced by Spaniards, especially Spanish missionaries. So, the problem is always, in a way, of a similar kind, and it's very like, I think, the problem that an actor has in conning up his or her script. It's getting into the shoes and the mind of someone very different from yourself. And obviously, if you're dealing with the remote past, it becomes, I think, progressively harder. The further the culture you're studying is removed from your own. And it does have, I said I was against making moral judgments, but I think history does have a moral effect on the person who studies it if he or she does so conscientiously, which is that it alerts your sensibilities to difference. And if you can bring yourself, to sympathise with all these horrible evil in the past, then you're more likely to sympathise with people in other cultures than your own in your own day. And I think it can actually make you a better person.
So in that way, it serves the same purpose as literature, right? Which opens up your eyes to these very, very different perspectives. Sometimes when you go to the movies and you find yourself empathizing with the villain, right? You have to remind yourself oftentimes that they are the villain. I remember, I forget who the author was. I read this wonderful book. It was a pretty old book, and it was about Cortez and the conquest of Mexico City. The classic from 100 years ago. I forget who it was that wrote the
Prescott.
book. I'm sure
Was it Prescott?
Yes. And I remember reading that. Oh gosh, it read like a novel, and these swashbuckling vagabonds, right? And, you read this and it made you feel, that these folks were bloodthirsty in some ways, but they were heroic in others. And it was a very, I found myself transformed by reading that book. because it situated me so much in the context when I read it.
Well, of course, they were a mixture of virtues and vices, like the rest of us. I mean, in that, that's another reason for avoiding moral judgments, because, as our good Lord said, let he who is without sin among you cast the first stone. And obviously, you're never going to be studying someone who is completely virtuous unless you're studying God, and that's outside the province of the historian. So you do have to be tolerant of people's moral deficiencies in the way that you hope others will be tolerant of your own. I read that book of Prescott's when I was 10 years old because I was going to Mexico. But in my naivety, I didn't realize that the part of Mexico I was going to isn't even mentioned in the book. And I spent quite a long time at the age of 10 trying to puzzle out what the mismatch was between this book, which is all about central Mexico and all about the campaign to conquer Tenochtitlan, and I was, 1,000 miles away in the southwest of the country. But even at the age of 10, I think I was very impressed by Prescott's own moral commitment to what he was doing, and of course he was writing at the time of very, very serious tension between the United States and Mexico, and the book was a sort of kind of textbook for the Americans who invaded Mexico in the Spanish in the Mexican-American War, and because Prescott himself was somewhat equivocal, but he was pretty much against that way of resolving the political conflict by violence, and I think you get that sense when you're reading the book.
Well, I mean, do you think that people have trouble keeping these complex historical narratives in their heads? I mean, when we think about national identity, when we think about the kinds of simple moral stories that we like to read as children, I mean, historical reality is so complex, and there are multiple perspectives. Do you think that is something that requires discipline, that requires practice, that requires the exercising of a historical muscle? And is that muscle under-exercised in most educated people? Should we have sort of gyms where people learn how to exercise their historical muscles?
Most educated people aren't interested in history. Even you gave it up, Greg, and you're a real intellectual. And of course, for most people, it's the past, and it doesn't matter to them. They're interested in what's going to happen tomorrow. To some extent, we do like the good. We like the white hat, black hat narrative, right? Cowboys are good, Indians are bad, and now Indians are good, cowboys are bad. The English were bad when we were revolting against them, then they were good in the 1940s. I mean, people like simplistic narratives, right? Well, of course, and the moral apologue may well be the oldest form of literature in the world. I mean, we can't say that for certain because the oldest form of literature in the world greatly antedates the evidence. But, a lot of historians of literature think that is at least a very strong possibility. And, when I say I don't make moral judgments in history, and I hope, it's not, unfashionable, or at least, even if it's unfashionable, I hope it's still tolerated if one doesn't do that. But I don't mean by that I don't think other people should make moral judgments if they want to. I mean, if that's what turns you on, for God's sake, go ahead and do it. I just won't take any interest in your work myself. But when I was a schoolboy, I was the secretary of the school debating society, and I was amazed reading the sort of 19th century minutes of the school debating society, how all the questions they debated were moral questions, and they were always framed as historical problems. So, there would be a motion such as, this House believes that King Charles I was a bad king. so that the value of history in people's moral education was obviously a very important part of the culture of that period. And if people want to go on using it in that way, I'm absolutely not in the business of telling other people what they should do. I'm only in the business of defending what I do myself. And so it's perfectly okay if people want to do that. I think if you do that, one of the things that you've got to accept is that you will, as you say, Greg, oversimplify, and that the truth is never going to be that black and white. It's never going to be that clear, because was Charles I, a bad king? Yes, but he was also a good king. And the problem with these moral questions in history is that there are usually two answers. And the first is yes, and the other is no, and they're both true simultaneously, because everybody is a mixture of virtue and vice.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your latest book, one of the takeaways that I got was that the Spanish Empire was a lot more sophisticated than we in the Anglo-American world give it credit for, right? So, at least my historical training was done in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution and in the shadow of the Enlightenment. And of course, this was an English project, somewhat a French project, a German project, and the Spaniards, they were the backwards folks, right? They had the Inquisition, and they had the terrible conquest and slaughter, and the what is it, the Black Legend or whatever. And what I think you emphasized was the profound technological sophistication that was necessary in order for the maintenance of this empire to persist for as long as it did. And I think that was I think the intent of the book was to dig into the engineering in particular of all these public works and infrastructures that made empire possible.
Yes, it's a history of engineering in the Spanish Empire. I think the very beginning of the 19th century, so when the Spanish Empire was really coming to its end, and all these other, British and French and German and US empires were really getting going, Humboldt, who was almost universally respected in that day as the greatest scientist of his time, pointed out that the Spanish monarchy actually spent more on science, invested more on what we would now call scientific research than any other state in the world at the time. And that was true. Made an accurate observation there, and that's something you can test objectively, I think, against the sort of records, and he was right. Yet Spain has never been regarded elsewhere as a great kind of cynosure of scientific sophistication. On the whole, however, I would say that from the 16th to the 18th centuries, Spain was in the forefront of scientific innovation and the application of science to practical problem solving, especially on an imperial level. And that's not because Spaniards were cleverer or better, but to some extent it's because they had these huge problems which the empire imposed and demanded research to solve. The most obvious example is longitude. If you've got this vast empire, the Spanish Empire is the biggest empire the world has ever seen, encompassing a greater variety of biomes, of natural environments than anybody had ever experienced, encompassing two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, which until the Spaniards did it, as far as we know, nobody had crossed before, certainly not, in one voyage. And certainly not established viable routes of communication to and fro across those those oceans, the shores of which the Spanish Empire spanned. And of course it also, though this perhaps isn't so important from the point of view of the challenge to science, encompassed an unprecedented variety of cultures. I mean, literally thousands of different cultures, people in all of which came to sense of belonging to this universal monarchy. So this is a very remarkable phenomenon, and it couldn't be done, it couldn't even be faced without facing up to the technical challenges. Things like, how do you survive in all these different environments, all of which have different disease environments with them? That requires, sort of medical research. How do you cope with the earthquakes? That also requires new techniques in construction. How do you span rivers bigger, and at a higher altitude than anybody in Europe had ever had to span before? How do you create a network of communications which encompasses such a vast area, bigger than any communication system had ever had to confront in the past? So all of those are technical problems. They are to a great extent. Some of them are scientific, some of them are technological in perhaps a narrower sense. But engineers were critical in solving all of those problems, and therefore you can't begin to understand the Spanish Empire without understanding the tremendous effort that the monarchy put into creating the infrastructures that made it viable, that made it possible. And of course they made it viable and possible both in terms of confronting the environmental challenges, and also, I think when Manolo and I wrote, we got together to write this book, one of the things that we had in mind was what did engineers contribute to the political functioning of the empire? And I think that was crucial as well, because if you got an empire, especially if you've got a pre-industrial empire like that of Spain, and you're trying to manage this vast enterprise from a very small country with a very small population, a very restricted domestic resource base, a poor, small country. In order to do that, you need indigenous collaborators. Now, you mentioned the black legend, Greg, of Spanish cruelty and oppression. No matter how cruel or oppressive you are, you can't run an empire of that sort with pre-industrial technology unless you can reconcile sufficient indigenous people to it. And I think the role of the engineers was critical in that as well, because I think that what the Spanish Empire did for its subjects, I know, okay, killed a lot of them, but what it really did for them that was positive was create these infrastructures, these communications, which enabled more trade, more prosperity, more growth, enabled access to parts of the world that producers in those regions had never had before. So it's a literally enriching empire, and if you can enrich, a critical mass of your subjects, especially their elites, who are absolutely vital as mediators between the Spaniards and the bulk of the indigenous population, then you've got a viable empire. And I think it's true, every pre-industrial empire needs to have this dimension. It needs to have, some kind of benignity, some kind of, plus, that extra value that it offers to subject people. And I think the engineers were the guys who gave the Spanish Empire that character.
Well, we talk about the Pax Romana, and we now talk about the Pax Americana. No one talks about the Pax Hispanica, right? But it does seem that was one of the big contributions of the Spanish, was to create this region within which the conflicts had been more or less eliminated between the different groups that had previously been fighting each other quite often and quite violently, right?
Yes, that certainly was what the Spanish monarchy consistently hoped to do. They were never entirely successful because these indigenous communities, their traditional hatreds and rivalries ran very, very deep. I mentioned the course that I do with my students at Notre Dame on these indigenous documents, and one of the things that comes through the documents, and which often shocks my students, is how conflict was going on, sometimes sublimated, sometimes diverted into litigation in the Spanish courts, sometimes taking the form of attempts to manipulate the Spaniards into collaborating in terrible, bloody acts of vengeance, the one indigenous group against another. So they never entirely, I don't think, eliminated the internal divisions of these areas that they brought together in the empire. And of course, you can see that in the subsequent, the post-colonial history of the former Spanish-American republics, which is, extremely tragic and, just as bloody and sad and racially divided as ever the colonial period was. And I'm afraid, that one of the lessons that I've learned from history is that hatred is a very intractable emotion that has extraordinary enduring powers, and people tend, to change their friends a lot. Again, history of international relations basically is the history of shifting alliances. People always change their friends, but they keep the same enemies. And I think, for all the good intentions of the Spaniards, they never quite created the sort of Pax Hispanica which might fully deserve the name. Of course, the Pax Romana didn't deserve the name either. But.
Mm-hmm. So, in other words, the Spanish, when they showed up, there were people who were ready to put the Spanish to use, right? I mean, it reminds me a bit of some descriptions of the U.S. in Afghanistan, where the locals, were able to leverage the presence of the Americans to get involved in old rivalries, right, that predated perhaps even the arrival of the British. But one of the things I was interested in was the diffusion of this Spanish engineering expertise. I talked to Joel Mukir a while back, and he talked about how the English mechanics would go throughout the world. I mean, not just within the empire, but also throughout Europe to help improve the manufacturing capabilities of countries on the continent. We don't hear a lot about these Spanish engineers diffusing through the world, although I did read a memoir of some friends of mine had an Argentine ancestor who wrote a memoir, and he wrote about how during the gold rush in the United States, lots and lots of Argentine and Chilean mining engineers came to California, and they played a huge role in the development of the gold mines in the U.S. So was there diffusion of this expertise in engineering, shipbuilding, and so forth outside of the Spanish Empire and into the other countries of the world? Yes,
I should preface this by saying I very much agree with your analogy with the United States and Afghanistan, and to some extent, the experience of these rather unfortunate U.S. quasi-imperial interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on does demonstrate that even in industrial states with tremendous technological resources at their disposal can't just call the shots. They also need to defer to indigenous sensibilities and opinions and get enough indigenous people on their side if they're to have any chance of success. But that's even more true in the pre-industrial period, when they just haven't got the technology, they haven't got the firepower, to make people do what they want. As for the sort of mobility of these engineering guys, I mean, I do think it is impressive that this very small country of Spain was able to, get enough manpower out into its peripheral zones to make empire viable. particularly if you compare it with the French in the same sort of period. The French Empire in the continental part of the New World, and at least, certainly the big area of Louisiana, which they tried to incorporate into their monarchy. It never really took off, and I think the main reason was they just couldn't get enough French people to go out there. And I know maybe France is a nicer place to be in than
it's
Spain.
really hard to get good wine in Louisiana, I think.
Yes, well, of course, it was a very challenging environment in many ways. But the Spaniards had even more challenging environments where they built great cities and homes from home, where they were able to get colonists to go out, and not least these engineers who were so critical to the success of the enterprise. And I think that's partly because Spain is a poor homeland, and it was a very competitive world in terms of social acceptability, and you could escape that by going out into the frontiers. The monarchy was also willing to pay people. I mean, some of these engineers got very handsome rewards. I mean, sometimes it took them many years, because their pay was always in arrears. And very often in the book we tell some stories of some poor individuals who sort of rather spent their salaries in advance and got into terrible trouble, because very often the monarchy is literally years in arrears with people's pay. Nonetheless, if you managed your finances well, you could do quite well out of being a profession in demand in these very desperate circumstances of the frontier, where engineering skills were at such a tremendous premium. Occasionally, I mean, quite a lot of these guys were amateurs, an awful lot of them were soldiers, and a tremendous number were religious. They were priests, they were friars. There was a great guy in the 16th century, Ambrosio de San Benito, he was called, who was a friar, who, because he was a friar and he was committed to poverty, he did all these marvellous engineering jobs, and he didn't charge the monarchy for them, so he was very popular back in Madrid. But you could make money out of this enterprise, and I suppose you also, some of these engineers were just attracted by the sheer challenges, and of course, although I say Spain was a small country, was able to supply this need from its own manpower, they did recruit a lot of engineers from the Netherlands and Italy, particularly, as well. But the monarchy invested a lot of money in engineering education. I think that's also critical, partly through the armed services and the church, but increasingly, of course, in the 18th century, through dedicated schools of engineering. So,
and I think you mentioned most of the
challenge,
engineers,
but somehow they managed to scrape together enough guys to overcome it.
And I think you mentioned in the earliest part of the empire, they were leaning heavily on engineers recruited from their Italian territories, right, where there was a lot of engineering.
I mean, the Antonelli family, who are the great example, they were really important, and especially in designing and improving fortifications. If you're talking about imperial infrastructure, fortification is pretty fundamental. But the empire needed everything. It needed roads, it needed bridges, it needed water supplies, it needed shipyards, it needed roads, it needed sanitation and hospitals. I think one of the surprising chapters of the book for people who don't know much about the Spanish Empire, and even for those who do, will be the chapter on hospitals and sanitation, because that was a heroic undertaking in which the monarchy, again, had the wisdom to invest very heavily. No other empire of the early modern period did this. The Spanish built literally thousands of hospitals in their empire, and those were of enormous importance just in keeping labour alive. Because, as we all know, all these empires tended to fail in one very important respect, which is they tended to fail in keeping their subjects alive, and overwhelmingly that's because of new diseases which colonization, trade, spread, and which indigenous populations are not equipped by inherited immunity to cope with. So, you know, this effort to keep people alive was absolutely critical. The hospitals were critical to it because, of course, the hospitals were only for poor people. They were very largely they were for indigenous people and for slaves. If you had any money, you didn't go to a hospital. you paid a physician to come and visit you. So the range of infrastructure that the empire required was very substantial and involved really new thinking about new kinds of investment that states had to make, which they hadn't really had to make before.
Well, what was astonishing to me when I look at the Spanish Empire is the extent to which the metropole was able to maintain its control for so long, right? I mean, it would be extremely difficult for them to send out an army, right, to reconquer one of these territories if they decided to spin off. And yet they didn't spin off until the 1800s. So how did that technology work? I mean, when you it takes 6 months to a year to just communicate back and forth. I mean, if you think of the Philippines, it was crazy. How did they continue to maintain their relevance? I mean, what did the Spanish continue to offer to the local elites that kept them in the fold for so long?
Well, I think the metropolis, as you put it, I think the king actually wasn't very important except as a sort of figurehead, except as this kind of cynosure, this focus of loyalty, which people only felt in a very vague way, because, you know, particularly to most indigenous people in the New World, the King of Spain was such a remote figure who belonged to a sort of kind of cultural tradition that they simply weren't equipped to understand. He was almost irrelevant, and you know that, as you rightly point out, that communications were so slow. Now, just to get a message from Madrid to Mexico City typically took, 130, 150 days. So by the time, you knew what the king wanted you to do, it was irrelevant anyway because the situation had changed. And I mean, we don't describe this part of the story in the book, but typically, if you were a Spanish official in one of these remote places and an order came from the king, you get all the people of the locality out in the main square or whatever was the meeting place, and you take the document that the king had given you and you kiss it and you place it on your head in token of submission, and then you'd sort of unroll it and you'd read it out and then you'd roll it up and ignore it because it didn't matter. So that although in a way you're right, there was a kind of central control in the sense that everybody wanted the empire to continue to hang together, or almost everybody did for most of the time. To a very great extent, people just did their own thing in the localities. And indigenous communities, had their own rulers. Even very often within cities, the indigenous quarter, had one town council, and the Spanish quarter had another, and they just got on with things. And when they had disputes, they had this marvelous Spanish legal system, which they could defer to, which they could use to arbitrate. If they didn't want to fight each other, they could refer disputes that they had to the courts, and very often these disputes would never be resolved. The courts would just go on considering them for generations, sometimes literally for centuries, without any resolution, and that kind of suited everybody because it meant because when you got involved in these lawsuits, what you really wanted was that the other person shouldn't win. That was more important than winning yourself. So in a way, the local decision making and the postponement, sometimes indefinite postponement of decisions which might have caused strife, these are really the keys to making the system work, in my opinion. But you still have to understand that against the background of having this critical mass of support for the empire amongst the indigenous population, which is the sort of payback from having all this infrastructural investment which enriches indigenous people and especially their elites.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to turn to the history of...
I think the early demographic collapse is also, very interesting because, we think of this and we think of the horror of all these millions of people dying and history is full of this kind of disaster. Just think of the Black Death in Europe. Mm-hmm. The horrible reality you have to acknowledge is that when a lot of people die, it's actually quite good for the survivors. Mm-hmm. Because
that's true in the Black Plague too. It's true in the Black Death.
Yeah, they have
as well.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, even COVID, winnowed expensive parts of the population, which some people were actually, I think, secretly quite content to see die. So, in a strange way, the demographic collapse set the imperial enterprise up for success. People didn't think that at the time because obviously, all these people were a precious resource, and Spanish administrators drove themselves nuts, sort of worrying about the loss of population and almost, sort of blaming the indigenous people for dying. So I think they realised that it would have positive effects for the future of the empire, but it did have such, sadly, but realistically, it did have such positive effects.
Well, do you think the Spanish were in a unique position to create empire, given their recent experience in the Spanish Peninsula and the Reconquista? I mean, did that give them experience with managing?
No, I think that's a myth. I think that's something which people used to think. I never thought it, and I still don't think it. The guys who forged the empire had no memory of the Reconquista. None of them had taken any part in it. The conquest of the Canary Islands was relevant in the very early days because it provided models of finance which were transplanted to the New World, and some institutional experiences and economic experiences in the Canary Islands dealing with the sort of indigenous population that the Spaniards encountered there replicated to some extent the sort of problems that they encountered in the New World. So I think that was relevant, but dealing with Moors, no, that had nothing to do with it. In a way, it made it more difficult because particularly Spanish missionaries, in struggling to interpret the culture of indigenous people, tended to see indigenous religions in terms of Islam or Judaism or classical paganism. And actually, of course, indigenous religions had nothing in common with any of those. So if anything, the Moorish precedent was misleading. I don't think it helped at all.
Now, I want to turn to your history of food. As I mentioned, this was perhaps one of my favorite your books.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's kind of you to say so.
But you mentioned that the history. Now, this was, I think, 20 years ago or so that you published this book, and you said at the time that the history of food was one that was only recently getting attention, right? And I think probably in the last 20 years it's expanded quite a bit, but it is puzzling that something that is so central to our existence, got so little historical examination. I mean, the economic historians, as you say, studied how the stuff was produced, but then lost interest as soon as it showed up on the plate. But I mean, 1492 was probably one of, if not the most consequential event in food history. And I think a lot of people are unaware of the impact of 1492 on our diets and so forth. But what is it about food history? What can it tell us beyond just the pleasures that we get from the expansion of our diet? What can it tell us about the human experience that is worthy of study?
Well, of course, you're right that when I wrote the book, there was no interest in this subject amongst professional historians. That's why I had to write the book, because I was teaching an environmental history course at the time, and our relationship with the environment is at its most intimate when we eat it, and of course, we can't begin to understand the human experience without taking on board these things which historians until recently really shamefully neglected, like food and sex and dance and sleep, these things which are really important in people's lives and which we do have to cover in our work. And I suppose, now that I mean, since I wrote the history of food, it's become, a major topic for historians, and there are departments of it, really. And I also, wrote an attempt at a non-Eurocentric history of the world about 30 years ago, and then, suddenly it became a major industry amongst historians, and now there are so many books on, you could fill a library with them alone. So maybe this will now happen to engineering in empires, and that we'll get a rash of study of that as well. But I don't think I need to say more about the importance of food in history. It's just obvious. There is a sense in which we are what we eat, and we can't understand ourselves without studying both the content of our meals and the ways in which we eat them, the manners, the habits, the behaviours that we bring to the table, or wherever it is we do our eating, because nowadays, I'm sorry to say, an awful lot of people seem to do it in the street.
Well, I mean, do you think that there is something fundamentally different about studying the history of ideas as opposed to the history of our material lives? I mean, obviously the sources are different. I mean, you talk about, what is it that is unique about people compared to these other animals? And, when it comes to studying the material world, I mean, we could study that in ways that are similar to the ways that we study the material life of animals, right? We could study the buildings in the same way we study ant heaps and termite mounds and so forth. But when it comes to ideas, that's something that is very different. Do you find that the historiographical techniques are radically different? Do you find that there's a difference in the level of evidence that you need to make claims about these different types of history?
I don't think I do think that. I mean, I think you're right that the balance is slightly different. The history of ideas, obviously, the balance tends more towards to reading the intellectual output of people who do a lot of thinking. But the way I tried to write the history of ideas wasn't really like that. I mean, I tried both to set the history of ideas in a very broad environmental historical context, and to show how the thinking of successive generations reflected other kinds of change, material change, economic change, and particularly environmental change. And of course, I also, deployed an awful lot of resources of what I call cognitive archaeology in this in this book. I mean, in my history of ideas, most history of ideas, start with the ancient Greeks, or if they really, sort of want to be generous about it, they might go back to the Mesopotamians or something. My history of ideas starts in the Paleolithic era. You don't get to the Greeks until you're a third of the way through the book. So an awful lot of it is actually based on archaeological evidence. And the other big thing that I tried to do in that book, although nobody seems to responded to this very much or taken any great interest in it, was that I tried to see the history of thought also as a problem in cognitive science. So, the book starts with a lot of kind of scientific stuff, neurological stuff about how we think and where we get ideas, how we have ideas in the first place. So for me, it was like all the other things that I do. I try to deploy all the resources that are available to an educated mind, and apart from the differences of balance, I don't see any fundamental difference between research in the history of ideas and research in material culture. At the moment, I'm writing a history of primatology. I mean, another course that I try to teach at the University of Notre Dame is about the history of primatology, and I think I'm now ready to write a sort of the book about it. And I've always been interested in comparing human behaviour, human culture, the topic with which we started this chat, Greg. I've always been interested in comparing human behaviour with that of other animals, and especially, of course, those that are close to us in evolutionary terms, such as other primates and especially the other animals that we tend to call great apes. So, given that that's fundamental to my understanding of what it is I do, it tends to make every subject quite heavy in material evidence and also in the appropriation of work from other disciplines, especially scientific ones.
Well, it seems that you straddle or maybe toggle between the notion of history as a social science and history as part of the humanities.
Well, I don't.
I mean, is history unique in that sense? Is history unique?
No, I
in that sense?
consider it. I don't consider it a science in itself. I think, as I say, I think you have to draw on other disciplines, especially the scientific ones, if you're going to be a good historian. But I don't think it's a scientific discipline. It is, as I said earlier, fundamentally a humanistic one, in which whatever you're doing, you can't avoid texts. They're absolutely fundamental. The effort to understand other people is fundamentally a humanistic duty. And whether you're doing it by looking at, their postals and middens, or whether you're looking at it, studying it by reading their philosophical disquisitions, you're still doing basically the same job, trying to use the evidence they've left us to get inside their minds and lives. And that's fundamentally a humanistic problem, and requires, I think, humanistic sensibility and interest in evidence for what it tells us about the minds that created it. So I do see, and I mentioned also that I'm, a big user of art as a source of documentation. So I'm for me, history isn't a science; it's an art. It's a humanistic discipline. I make no apology for that. I revel in it. I think that's what makes it fascinating, because the problems of science are fundamentally, if they're genuinely problems of science, they're fundamentally solvable. I mean, when scientists take on subjects that really are beyond their province, like, sort of what's the origin of the cosmos, or, does God exist, all those sorts of questions. Science, that's rather foolish over-ambition on the part of scientists. But if a question is genuinely scientific, then it's in principle answerable. If a problem is scientific, it's in principle solvable. Whereas a problem in the humanities is in principle insoluble, because you can never have a completely objective assessment of the evidence.
Well, Felipe, I think it's pretty clear that the courses that you're offering to your students at Notre Dame are ones that we all wish that we could drop in on and take. But since we most of us can't.
Delighted to have you. You pop over to Indiana anytime you're free, and I'll entertain you with great pleasure.
Well, since for most of us that's not an option, we have to fall back on your books. And this latest book, How the Spanish Empire Was Built, the 400-year history, is a fantastic place to start. But also don't forget Civilizations and Out of Our Minds and Pathfinders and all of the rest. Thanks so much for joining me.
You're very kind. It's been a great treat to talk to you and a privilege to be on the podcast.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.